Outlaws storm into the Painted Rose Saloon, mocking the quiet, unassuming saloon girl, Ruby Monroe, thinking they've found an easy target. But Ruby isn't what she seems. Behind the soft smile and flowing dress lies the deadliest gunslinger. In the West, a woman with a secret mission to expose a ruthless conspiracy of land theft and murder. As the gang's threats turn violent, Ruby is forced to make a life-or-death decision that will ignite a storm of bullets, betrayal, and justice in a town on the brink of collapse. Before we dive in, buckle up, get ready, and don't forget to subscribe. There's a special surprise waiting for you tomorrow. The Painted Rose Saloon was alive with music and the clinking of glasses as patrons crowded its tables, laughing and hollering. Ruby Monroe moved gracefully through the chaos, her practiced smile never faltering as she balanced a tray of drinks. She was a vision in her crimson dress, its intricate lace giving her the look of elegance that masked her quiet vigilance. Ruby had perfected the art of blending in, playing the role of the charming saloon girl. It was safer that way, safer for her and safer for everyone else. She set a glass of whiskey in front of a rancher and gave him a wink. "Careful now, mister." "Webb, that's your fourth tonight," the rancher chuckled, his weathered face lighting up. "You always know how to keep a man honest, Ruby." Her smile didn't waver, but her attention shifted to the far corner of the room, where Sheriff Jasper Cole sat nursing his drink. His dark eyes scanned the crowd, his lips curled in a perpetual sneer. Ruby knew better than to trust him. Cole wasn't just corrupt, he was dangerous. He turned a blind eye to the outlaw gangs that had been bleeding the town dry, and Ruby suspected he was profiting from their crimes. As the night wore on, Ruby overheard whispers among the patrons, rumors of Mad Dog Brady and his gang heading toward Red Fork. The name sent a ripple of unease through the saloon. Brady was known for his brutality, leaving a trail of blood wherever he went. Ruby's grip on the tray tightened as a chill ran down her spine. Trouble was coming, and she knew the town wasn't ready for it. Near midnight, Ruby stepped outside to take a breath of cool air. The stars stretched endlessly over the frontier, their beauty marred by the growing tension in her chest. She leaned against the wooden post of the porch, letting her eyes scan the dusty streets. Even in the quiet, her instincts kept her alert. "Long night, Ruby?" Sadie, the Painted Rose's owner, stepped out and lit a cigarette. "Feels like it," Ruby replied, her voice soft but steady. "You hear about Brady?" Sadie nodded, her expression darkening. "Word is, he's looking to make an example of someone. This town's got enough problems without him stirring up trouble." Ruby didn't respond, but her jaw tightened. She had made a promise to herself not to get involved, to let the past stay buried. But the more she saw the fear in people's eyes, the harder it became to stay silent. A sudden commotion inside drew their attention. A glass shattered, followed by shouts and laughter. Ruby sighed and stepped back into the saloon, the din swallowing her whole. She couldn't shake the feeling that the peace she had worked so hard to maintain was slipping through her fingers. For now, she would play her part, keep her head down, and wait. But deep inside, Ruby knew the storm was coming, and it wouldn't be long before she had to draw the iron she had sworn to put away forever. The Painted Rose Saloon wasn't prepared for the chaos that erupted when Mad Dog Brady and his gang thundered into town the next morning. The sound of hooves pounding against the dirt street echoed like distant thunder, growing louder until 6 riders appeared, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. Brady rode at the front, his wiry frame silhouetted by the rising sun. His face was sharp, cruel, and his eyes burned with the kind of malice that sent weaker men scrambling to get out of his way. Ruby was inside the saloon, wiping down the bar, when the double doors were kicked open with enough force to rattle the walls. The room fell silent as the gang filed in, their boots heavy against the floorboards. Brady sauntered to the center of the room, his long coat swaying with every step. He looked around, his lips curling into a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well, well," Brady drawled, his voice slick and venomous. "Looks like Red Fork's as much of a dump as I remember." No one dared to reply. The bartender froze mid-pour, his trembling hands spilling whiskey onto the counter. Ruby kept her head down, feigning disinterest, though her heart pounded in her chest. She recognized Brady from years ago, back when her reputation as Iron Vesper was enough to keep men like him in check. Now she was just another saloon girl, and she needed to keep it that way, for now. Brady's gaze landed on Ruby, his smirk widening. "You?" he called out, his voice cutting through the silence. "Come here." Ruby hesitated for only a moment before, forcing a sweet smile and stepping forward, her red dress catching the sunlight streaming through the windows. She could feel his gang's eyes on her, their leers making her skin crawl. Brady tilted his head, studying her like a predator sizing up its prey. "You look like someone who knows how to make a man feel welcome," he said, his tone mocking. Ruby's smile didn't falter. "Welcome to the Painted Rose. What can I get for you?" Brady's grin widened as he leaned closer, his breath reeking of whiskey. "How about some respect? This place pays me now. Call it protection money." The tension in the room thickened as the gang chuckled behind him, their hands hovering near their gun belts. Ruby glanced around, seeing the fear on the faces of the saloon's patrons. Her fingers twitched, aching for the familiar weight of the revolvers hidden under the floorboards upstairs, but she couldn't act, not yet. Sadie stepped out from behind the bar, her voice steady but firm. "We don't want any trouble here, Brady. You've had your fun, now leave." Brady's grin vanished, replaced by a cold, menacing glare. He reached for the bottle on the counter and hurled it against the wall, the shattering glass echoing through the room. "You don't get to tell me what to do," he snarled. Ruby clenched her fists at her sides, forcing herself to stay calm. She would let this play out, for now. But deep down, she knew Brady had just made his first mistake. Ruby kept her head down as the tension in the saloon finally began to ease. After smashing the bottle, Brady barked orders at his men to grab drinks and sit, as if he owned the place. The townsfolk and saloon regulars kept their distance, their eyes darting nervously toward the gang. Ruby moved quietly back to the bar, her every movement calculated to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. As Brady's gang settled into their drinks, he leaned against the counter, smirking at Sadie. "You're lucky I'm feeling generous today. But next time I'll expect a proper welcome and payment, unless you'd rather see this place burn to the ground." Sadie's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't answer. Ruby admired her resilience, but she could see the way Sadie's hands trembled slightly as she wiped the counter. Brady laughed, clearly enjoying the fear he inspired, before turning and heading for a table with his men. Ruby's gut twisted as she returned to serving drinks. She caught snippets of their conversation, spoken just loudly enough to flaunt their arrogance. Brady talked about a big deal happening soon, and though he didn't reveal specifics, Ruby's ears perked up when he mentioned the sheriff. "I told Cole to keep the farmers in line," Brady said, slamming his drink on the table. "We're clearing out that land one way or another. Railroad's paying good money to get it done fast." Ruby's heart raced. The railroad, of course. The company had been inching closer to Red Fork for months, buying up land wherever they could dry, and if the owners refused to sell, they disappeared. Ruby had suspected corruption, but this confirmed it. The sheriff was working with Brady, and the governor was likely pulling the strings. She continued moving through the room, feigning disinterest while piecing the puzzle together. Brady's gang wasn't just here to make trouble. They were part of something bigger, a scheme to seize land by any means necessary. Her mind raced, weighing her options. She could stay quiet and let the pieces fall into place, or she could act now and risk exposing herself. Later that evening, Ruby slipped upstairs to her room. The saloon's creaking floorboards and muffled laughter faded as she closed the door and locked it. She pulled up a loose floorboard, revealing a hidden compartment where two well-worn revolvers rested alongside a small stash of ammunition. Her fingers hovered over the weapons, memories flooding back of the bloodshed and vengeance that had made her a legend. She hadn't drawn those guns in years, vowing to leave that life behind. But now, the weight of the town's survival pressed down on her. If Brady's plan succeeded, Red Fork would be nothing more than a ghost town, its people driven out or killed. Ruby closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She couldn't act yet. Not tonight, but she wouldn't let Brady destroy this town. She would find a way to stop him, quietly, carefully, and if it came to it, she would show them all why Iron Vesper was a name whispered in fear across the west. The sun rose over Red Fork, bathing the town in a golden glow that did little to chase away the creeping unease. Word traveled fast in the small frontier town, and by morning, everyone knew that Mad Dog Brady was here to stay. The townsfolk kept their heads down as his gang loitered outside the saloon, their laughter echoing through the dusty streets. Brady himself was nowhere to be seen, but his presence was felt in every corner of town. Ruby sat at a small table near the window of the Painted Rose, nursing a cup of coffee as she kept her eyes on the street. She didn't flinch when the sound of a gunshot cracked through the air, followed by screams. She set her cup down, her fingers tightening around the handle, but she stayed seated. Minutes later, a rancher stumbled into the saloon, his face pale and streaked with sweat. Brady's men, they hit the Fletcher homestead, he gasped, his voice shaking. Killed the whole family, burned it to the ground. The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Sadie, standing behind the bar, dropped the glass she'd been cleaning. Ruby's jaw tightened and her nails dug into the table. The Fletchers had been a kind, hard-working family who'd refused to sell their land to the railroad. Now they were gone, wiped out as an example to the rest of the town. "They can't get away with this," someone muttered, but the fear in their voice betrayed their hopelessness. Ruby stood, her chair scraping against the floor. She crossed the room to the rancher, her voice calm but firm. "Where's Brady?" "Now," the man shook his head. "Didn't see him. Just his men. They're probably back at their camp by now, celebrating." Sadie looked at Ruby, her eyes filled with worry. "Don't do anything foolish," she said softly. Ruby didn't reply. Instead, she turned and headed upstairs to her room. Her movements were deliberate as she closed the door behind her and retrieved the hidden revolvers from under the floorboards. She checked the cylinders, ensuring they were fully loaded, then strapped the holsters around her waist. The familiar weight of the guns steadied her, though it brought a bitter taste of memories she'd rather forget. By the time she returned, downstairs, the saloon was nearly empty, the remaining patrons speaking in hushed tones. Ruby walked to the bar, catching Sadie's wary gaze. "I won't do anything reckless," Ruby said, her voice low. "But I'm not going to sit back and let this happen again." Before Sadie could respond, Ruby stepped out into the sunlight. She moved purposefully through the streets, her sharp eyes scanning for any sign of Brady's gang. The air felt heavy, the kind of weight that comes before a storm. Ruby knew she couldn't face Brady head-on, not yet. But she would make sure he understood that Red Fork wasn't his to take. And if he pushed too far, he'd learn just how deadly the quiet saloon girl could be. The moon hung high over Red Fork as Ruby crouched in the shadows near the edge of town, her revolvers loaded and ready. She'd spent the day gathering information, piecing together where Brady's gang might strike next. Word around town was that they planned to collect protection money from the Painted Rose that very night, emboldened by their attack on the Fletcher homestead. Ruby's gut twisted at the thought of more violence, but she knew she had to act. The Painted Rose was quiet when Brady's men arrived, their boots crunching against the dirt as they approached the saloon. Ruby watched from her position behind a stack of crates across the street, her heart steady and her breath slow. There were 5 of them, their drunken laughter echoing in the stillness of the night. They didn't bother to keep their voices down, confident no one would dare challenge them. "Let's make this quick," one of them said, slamming open the saloon doors. "I'm thirsty." Ruby waited until the last of them disappeared inside before stepping out of the shadows. She moved swiftly, her boots silent on the ground as she crossed the street. The night air was cool against her skin, but her focus was sharp, her every sense heightened. Inside, the gang spread out, their presence filling the room with tension. Sadie stood behind the bar, her expression calm, but her hands gripping the edge of the counter. One of the men leaned against the bar, leering at her, while another kicked over a chair, laughing at his own destruction. "Where's Brady?" Sadie asked, her voice even, Boss don't need to dirty his hands for a place like this, one of them sneered. But he'll expect his cut come morning. You got that? Ruby slipped in through the back entrance, her steps careful and deliberate. The saloon's dim light cast long shadows across the room, and she used them to her advantage, moving undetected. She could see the gang clearly now, their postures loose and arrogant. It was the arrogance that would cost them. Ruby stepped into the open, her revolvers drawn. "You boys picked the wrong saloon," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. The men turned, their surprise quickly morphing into anger. "Who the hell are you?" one of them barked, reaching for his gun. Ruby didn't. "Give him the chance." Her first shot rang out, striking him in the shoulder and sending him crashing to the floor. Chaos erupted as the others scrambled for their weapons, but Ruby was faster. She moved with precision, her shots finding their marks before the men could even aim. In seconds, it was over. 3 of the gang members lay dead. One was writhing on the floor, and the last had fled out the front door, his footsteps fading. Into the night, Ruby lowered her guns, her breath steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She glanced at Sadie, who was staring at her in shock. "Tell Brady," Ruby said coldly. "This town isn't his to take." She holstered her revolvers and disappeared into the night before anyone could say a word. The town buzzed with whispers the next morning. News of the shootout at the Painted Rose spread like wildfire, each retelling adding more drama to the tale. By mid-morning, the name Iron Vesper was on everyone's lips, spoken in hushed tones and awe-struck murmurs. Some dismissed it as legend, a ghost from the past. But others swore that they had seen her, the infamous gunslinger who vanished years ago. Ruby kept her head down, blending into the crowd as best as she could while she made her way through the market. Her simple bonnet and plain dress helped mask her identity, but the murmurs followed her wherever she went. She could feel the tension in the air, a mix of fear and hope. People were desperate for a savior, someone to stand up against the likes of Mad Dog Brady, but Ruby knew better than to let them believe she was it. The truth was, she hadn't planned for the rumors to spread so quickly. Her intention had been to send a message to Brady, not to revive a legend. Now, with half the town convinced Iron Vesper was back, she'd drawn more attention than she'd wanted. Worse, Brady wasn't the kind of man to let such an insult go unanswered. Ruby slipped into an alleyway and leaned against the wall, taking a moment to catch her breath. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket, the edges worn from handling. It was one of the documents she'd taken from Brady's hideout the night before, evidence of a deal between the railroad company and the governor's office, signed and stamped in plain view. The terms were clear. The governor would clear land in exchange for a hefty bribe, and Brady was the muscle hired to enforce it. The enormity of the conspiracy weighed heavily on her. The people of Red Fork were pawns in a game of greed, their lives disposable in the eyes of those in power. Ruby had seen this before, in other towns, in other faces. She'd fought this fight before, and it had nearly destroyed her. A shadow fell across the alley, and Ruby's hand instinctively moved toward her revolver. But it was Sadie who stepped into view, her face pale but determined. "Ruby," Sadie said quietly, glancing over her shoulder. "They're saying it was you, that you're Iron Vesper." Ruby didn't answer immediately, her jaw tightening. "Let them talk," she finally said. Sadie shook her head. "You know Brady won't stop. He's already got his men combing the town, looking for whoever killed his gang." Ruby folded the paper and slipped it back into her pocket. "Then we make him come to us." Sadie's eyes widened. "Us?" Ruby stepped closer, her gaze steady. "This town isn't safe as long as he's here, but if we're going to stop him, we need more than just me. Spread the word, quietly. If anyone's willing to stand up, now's the time." Sadie hesitated, then nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I hope you know what you're doing." Ruby watched her leave, the weight of her decision settling over her like a heavy cloak. She didn't know if she could save Red Fork, but she would try. And if Brady wanted a fight, she would make sure it was one he would never forget. Brady's fury was palpable. His remaining gang members scurried to follow his orders as he paced in the dusty clearing they used as their camp. His face, usually twisted in a smug grin, was now a mask of rage. "Iron Vesper," he growled, slamming his fist into a wooden post. "I want her dead, do you hear me? Dead!" His men exchanged uneasy glances. They had heard the stories, just like everyone else. Iron Vesper was a name that carried a weight of finality, a ghost from the past who never missed, who left death in her wake. Facing her wasn't something any of them were eager to do, but Brady's wrath was almost as dangerous as the gunslinger herself. "We'll find her," one of them offered nervously. "She's got to be hiding in Red Fork." Brady stopped pacing and turned, his glare silencing the man. "No," he snapped. "She's not hiding, she's waiting, and we're going to make her regret it." Meanwhile, in town, Ruby felt the noose tightening around her. Brady's men were everywhere, questioning anyone who dared to make eye contact, kicking in doors and threatening shopkeepers. The tension was suffocating, and every gunshot or shout made people jump. Ruby stayed out of sight as best as she could, moving through alleyways and shadowed corners. She could feel the walls closing in, the weight of her secret pressing harder than ever. Every step she took felt like a gamble, one wrong move threatening to expose her and bring Brady's wrath crashing down on everyone around her. She found herself in the stables at the edge of town, where she knew she could speak freely without prying ears. Sadie was already there, waiting with a few others Ruby had trusted with the truth. They were townsfolk, farmers, shopkeepers, and ranch hands, people with more courage than experience, but they were all that stood between Red Fork and complete destruction. "We don't stand a chance against Brady's men," one of them said, his voice tinged with fear. "We're outgunned and outnumbered." Ruby nodded, her face grim. "That's true. But they've made a mistake. They think this town is weak, that we're scared, and maybe we are. But fear isn't a reason to give up." Sadie stepped forward, her voice firm. "Ruby's right. If we let Brady take Red Fork, we'll never get it back. We have to fight." There was a long silence before one of the ranch hands nodded. "What's the plan?" Ruby pulled out a map of the town, spreading it out on a hay bale. "We don't fight them head on. We use the town against them. Narrow streets, blind corners. We set traps, control the chaos. They won't know what hit them." As she laid out the details, Ruby couldn't ignore the gnawing doubt in her mind. These people were brave, but they weren't fighters. If her plan failed, the blood would be on her hands. Still, she knew there was no other choice. Brady wouldn't stop until Red Fork was his, or until he was dead, and Ruby wasn't about to let him win. The trap was set, but Ruby knew it wouldn't be long before Brady forced her hand. She spent the next day sharpening her plan, moving quietly through the town with Sadie and the few allies they had managed to recruit. Traps were laid in strategic places, barrels rigged to topple, ropes set to trip horses, and concealed firing positions established in the upper floors of buildings. Red Fork would become a maze of chaos if Brady came looking for trouble. But trouble found her first. Ruby was in the Painted Rose just after sunset, going over last-minute details with Sadie when a commotion erupted outside. Shouts and the pounding of hooves filled the air, and Ruby immediately knew something was wrong. She rushed to the window and peered out, her stomach sinking at the sight of Brady's men dragging someone off a horse and into the middle of the street. Sadie was beside her in an instant, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh no, Ruby, it's..." Ruby didn't need her to finish. She'd already seen it was Sadie, or at least the real Sadie, the one who had been caught trying to leave town hours earlier, hoping to find help. Ruby cursed under her breath. She had thought they'd covered their tracks, but Brady's men must have been watching every move more closely than she realized. Brady's voice rang out like a whip, silencing the street. "I've got something of yours, Vesper!" he bellowed, his words dripping with venom. He stood beside Sadie, his gun drawn and pressed to her temple. She struggled, but the men holding her had iron grips. Ruby felt a wave of fury and guilt wash over her. She had told Sadie the risks of leaving town, but now her closest ally was in the hands of a man who thrived on cruelty. Ruby clenched her fists and forced herself to think clearly. "You're hiding, but I know you can hear me," Brady shouted, pacing in front of the gathered crowd. "So here's the deal. You, come out. Face me like the gunslinger you're supposed to be, and maybe your friend here doesn't get a bullet in the head." Sadie looked up, her eyes wide with fear but defiant. Ruby's heart ached at the sight. "What do we do?" one of the townsfolk whispered from behind Ruby. Ruby turned to them, her expression steely. "We stick to the plan." She took a deep breath, grabbed her revolvers, and stepped out onto the saloon porch. Brady's eyes locked onto her instantly, and a slow grin spread across his face. "Well, well," he said, his voice thick with mockery. "The legend herself. You took your sweet time." Ruby didn't respond, her eyes fixed on Sadie. "Let her go, Brady," she said, her voice calm and cold. "This is between you and me." Brady laughed. "I think we'll keep her around, just to make things interesting." Ruby tightened her grip on her guns. The game had changed, and now the stakes were higher than ever. Ruby stood on the saloon porch, her hands hovering near her revolvers as she stared down Brady. The air was heavy with tension, the gathered townsfolk too, afraid to move or speak. Brady's grin widened as he pressed the barrel of his gun harder against Sadie's temple, clearly savoring the control he thought he had. "You think you're faster than me, Vesper?" he taunted. "Or are you just lucky that the stories made you bigger than you really are?" Ruby didn't answer. She took a step forward, slow and deliberate, her sharp eyes tracking every movement from Brady's men. They were spread out across the street, hands on their weapons, waiting for a signal. She couldn't risk a direct fight, not with Sadie so close to Brady. "You brought this on yourself, Brady," Ruby said, her voice low and steady. "You could have left Red Fork and spared your men. Instead, you made a mess I have to clean up." Brady's grin faltered, his eyes narrowing. Big talk for someone outnumbered. Ruby's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. "Who said I was outnumbered?" Before Brady could process her words, chaos erupted. One of Ruby's traps was triggered, a stack of barrels crashing down from a nearby rooftop, scattering two of Brady's men as they scrambled to avoid the sudden danger. Simultaneously, a sharp crack rang out as one of the townsfolk fired from a concealed position, hitting another gang member in the leg and sending him to the ground. Ruby moved in the same heartbeat. Her revolvers came up, firing with precision. Her first shot struck the man holding Sadie, and her second hit the gun Brady had pointed at her friend's head, sending it flying from his hand. Sadie ducked and scrambled away as Ruby advanced, her movements fluid and exact. Brady cursed and dove for cover as his men tried to rally, but Ruby gave them no time to regroup. She moved through the street like a shadow, using every blind corner and dark alley to her advantage. Each trap the townsfolk had set sprung with perfect timing. Ropes tripping men off their horses, smoke bombs creating confusion, and carefully aimed shots forcing Brady's gang into disarray. Ruby found herself in a standoff with two of the gang members behind a water trough. They fired wildly, their fear evident in their shaky aim. Ruby took a deep breath, stepped out into the open, and fired twice. Both men fell before they could react. By the time the dust settled, most of Brady's men were dead or incapacitated. Brady himself was crouched behind a wagon, his face twisted in frustration. Ruby stepped into the center of the street, her revolvers trained on him. "It's over, Brady," she said, her voice cold. "Your gang's done. The town's not yours to take." Brady glared at her, his hand inching toward a hidden knife. Ruby's eyes flicked to the movement, and she tightened her grip. This wasn't finished, not yet. Ruby stood in the middle of the street, her revolvers aimed squarely at Brady, who crouched behind the wagon. The remnants of the fight lingered. In the air, smoke, the acrid tang of gunpowder, and the groans of Brady's wounded men scattered around the battlefield. Townsfolk peeked out from windows and alleyways, their breaths held as they watched the final moments of the standoff unfold. "You've got nowhere to run, Brady," Ruby said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Surrender, or I finish this right now." Brady's lips curled into a defiant sneer. He stood slowly, his hands visible, but there was a glint in his eyes that Ruby didn't trust. You think you've won, he said, his tone mocking. You might have taken out my boys, but I've got more where they came from. You're just a myth trying to play hero. Ruby didn't flinch. Maybe, she replied, but you won't be around to see if I'm right. Brady's hand darted toward his belt, his hidden knife flashing in the moonlight as he lunged forward. Ruby reacted in an instant. Her revolver barked once, the shot echoing through the street as Brady staggered back, clutching his shoulder. The knife fell from his hand as he dropped to one knee, his expression twisting in pain and fury. You don't learn, do you? Ruby said, stepping closer, her aim unwavering. Brady glared up at her, blood seeping through his fingers. You think killing me will change anything? The governor, the railroad, they'll just send someone else. This town is already lost. Ruby shook her head, her jaw tightening. You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about Red Fork. It's about showing people like you that we don't roll over and die. It's about standing up. Brady chuckled bitterly, his laugh turning into a cough. Then do it. Go ahead, Vesper. Be the hero they all think you are. Ruby hesitated, her finger hovering over the trigger. The weight of the moment pressed down on her. She'd spent years trying to leave this life behind, trying to escape the bloodshed that had defined her. Killing Brady would end his reign of terror, but it wouldn't bring back the Fletchers or any of the others who had suffered because of him. The silence stretched as Ruby lowered her gun. No, she said, her voice firm. You're not worth the bullet. She kicked the knife away and stepped back, her revolver still trained on him. You're going to face justice, Brady, the kind you can't escape. Behind her, the townsfolk emerged cautiously, their fear giving way to determination. A few of them moved to restrain Brady, binding his hands as he cursed and struggled. Ruby turned to Sadie, who stood nearby, her face pale but resolute. It's over, Ruby said softly, at least for now. Sadie nodded, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. Thanks to you. Ruby holstered her guns, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Brady was defeated, but the fight against the corruption he served was far from over. The next morning, the town of Red Fork was alive with activity. Brady sat in the sheriff's office, his hands bound and his face a mask of defiance. Despite his injuries and defeat, he still carried an air of menace, as though he were plotting his next move even from behind bars. Outside, the townsfolk gathered, their voices rising in anger and relief as they talked about the previous night's events. Ruby stood on the steps of the Painted Rose, watching as the people of Red Fork began to reclaim their town. The windows were being boarded up, the streets cleaned of debris, and the wounded tended to. For the first time in weeks, the fear that had gripped the town seemed to loosen its hold. Sadie approached her, holding a steaming cup of coffee. You did it, Ruby, she said, handing her the cup. You gave them hope. Ruby took the coffee but shook her head. It's not over, Sadie. Brady was just the beginning. The governor, the railroad, they'll come for this place. They won't stop until they've taken everything. Sadie frowned, glancing at the crowd. Then we'll fight them, just like we fought Brady, together. Ruby looked at her friend, admiration and gratitude flickering in her eyes. But she couldn't share Sadie's optimism. She'd seen too much, lost too much, to believe that this would end so cleanly. The sound of horse hooves drew Ruby's attention. A group of riders approached, their uniforms crisp and their badges gleaming in the sunlight. The governor's enforcers had arrived. The leader, a tall man with a trimmed mustache and a cold, calculating gaze, dismounted and surveyed the town. His expression didn't change as he took in the damaged buildings and the somber faces of the townsfolk. He stopped in front of Ruby, his posture rigid. I'm Captain Grayson, he announced, loud enough for the crowd to hear. I've been sent to investigate the incident involving Mad Dog Brady and his men. Where is he? In the sheriff's office, Ruby said, her voice calm but firm. And he's not going anywhere. Grayson's eyes narrowed as he studied her. And who might you be? Ruby Monroe, she replied. Just a saloon girl. Grayson's lip curled slightly, but he said nothing. He turned to his men and motioned for them to retrieve Brady. The townsfolk watched in silence as the enforcers marched toward the sheriff's office. When they returned, Brady was in chains, but his smirk had returned. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice dripping with smugness. You think locking me up changes anything? You're all just pieces on a board, and the real players haven't even started yet." Grayson ignored him, mounting his horse and leading the group out of town. The crowd parted as they passed, their eyes following the enforcers until they disappeared over the horizon. Ruby let out a slow breath, the tension in her chest easing slightly. Sadie placed a hand on her shoulder. "He's gone. That's a win." "For now," Ruby said, her voice quiet. "But they'll be back." Sadie didn't argue, and Ruby turned, heading inside the Painted Rose. She needed time to think, to plan. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. The morning air was crisp as Ruby saddled her horse behind the Painted Rose. The town was still waking, the hum of life growing as people emerged from their homes to rebuild and move forward. Red Fork had survived the storm, but Ruby knew it wasn't safe yet. Not for her, and not for them. Sadie stepped out of the saloon, her arms crossed as she watched Ruby tighten the straps on her saddle. "You're really going, aren't you?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Ruby glanced over her shoulder, her expression softening. "I have to," she said. "Brady's gone, but the people behind him aren't. If I stay, I'll just paint a target on this town. They'll come here looking for me, and I won't let that happen." Sadie approached, her steps slow and deliberate. "You don't have to do this alone, Ruby. You've already done so much. Stay, and we'll fight together." Ruby shook her head. "You're stronger than you think, Sadie. The town is too. They proved that last night. But this fight, it's bigger than Red Fork. I need to take it to them, or it'll never stop." Sadie frowned, her eyes glistening. "I don't like it, but I get it. Just promise me one thing." Ruby raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "Come back someday," Sadie said, her voice cracking slightly. "When it's over." Ruby smiled faintly and pulled Sadie into a quick hug. "I'll do my best." With that, Ruby swung onto her horse and adjusted her hat, tilting it just enough to shield her eyes from the rising sun. She turned to look at Sadie one last time. "Keep them safe," she said simply, before clicking her tongue and urging her horse forward. As Ruby rode down the main street, the townsfolk stopped to watch her go. Some waved, others simply nodded in silent gratitude, their faces a mix of hope and sadness. Children whispered to each other, pointing at the woman who had become a legend overnight. At the edge of town, Ruby paused and looked back. Red Fork was still standing, the Painted Roses sign swaying gently in the breeze. It was a sight she wanted to remember, a reminder of what she was fighting for. Turning her gaze to the horizon, Ruby spurred her horse into a steady gallop. The open plains stretched out before her, vast and unyielding, much like the fight that lay ahead. She had no illusions about the path she'd chosen. It would be dangerous, filled with enemies more powerful than Brady could ever hope to be. But Ruby had faced worse, and she carried the resolve of a woman who had already defied the odds. The name Iron Vesper would ride with her, striking fear into the hearts of those who thrived on greed and corruption. Ruby Monroe was no longer hiding. She was a force of justice, and she wouldn't stop until the West was free from the grip of those who sought to control it. As she disappeared into the distance, the legend of Iron Vesper grew, etched into the hearts of those she had saved. Red Fork had been her battleground, but the fight was far from over. For Ruby, the journey had just begun.